Welcome to another ABC Radio National podcast. For more information, go to abc.net.au/rn.
Good morning, Ramona Koval here with a book show on ABC Radio National. And shortly, our legal pundit Nick Pullen will talk about the uses of images in books, especially on book covers, and the lengths celebrities and their managers will go to protect the image. And Cory Doctorow is a science fiction writer who not only publishes his work as books, but also for free on the web using Creative Commons licenses. And this means that other people can reuse and rejig his work and not be smacked with a fine for breaching copyright. So how does he make a living? And we're continuing our first-person reading of Alice Pung's memoir, Unpolished Gem. But first, I was telling you yesterday about science fiction accounting for nearly 10% of Russian book sales last year, behind children's books and mysteries and philosophy. But one extraordinarily popular writer who I hadn't heard of is Boris Akunin, whose books about the adventures of Erast Fandorin have made him both wealthy and famous. He's the country's most successful contemporary author, and his novels have sold more than 20 million copies, not just in Russia, but also in the US and Britain and 30 other countries. So who is he? Well, he's a classical philologist, an essayist and critic editor and literary translator of Japanese. And he only started writing his Tsarist-era detective novels at the age of 40. And who's this character, Erast Fandorin? Well, The Guardian says that he's got amazing deductive powers, an array of hidden weapons, and the lethal reactions of a samurai. He's a special agent, a gentleman, a polymath, and an all-round lucky bloke. He's capable of solving any mystery, murdered Russian generals, secret anarchist cells. Russia could certainly use someone like him to investigate the series of international crimes and misdemeanours we read about in the papers almost every week. He sounds absolutely marvellous, doesn't he? Anyway, talking of absolutely marvellous, an interesting issue arose recently, one that's not uncommon, where the release of a book was challenged not because of the writing, but because of the image on the cover. The book, which was a fairly benign work about Australian cricket, had amongst its photos on the front cover one of the captain of the Australian men's cricket team, Ricky Ponting. And Ricky Ponting's management were challenging the use of the photo, not because he owned the rights to the image, but because it was suggested that this was a misuse of an image, implying the cricketer's endorsement of the book. Now, this has become a common bluff by celebrities and celebrity management people who want to exert control over the way their clients are portrayed in the media. But if they're not the copyright holders, do they have any valid argument? And this is where the marvellous bit comes in. Nick Pullen is here to rescue me from this question. Nick is a lawyer and partner with Tress Cox, specialising in publishing and the media. Welcome again to the Book Show, Nick.
It's great to be here again. Thank you, Ramona.
Now, tell me about this situation. What was Ricky Ponting's management claiming in relation to the cover of the book?
Well, what originally happened was the author wanted to put a photo of Ricky Ponting on the front of his book on Australian cricket, and it was amongst other photographs, as I understand, and did the right thing and asked management for permission to use the photograph of Ricky Ponting. And as I also understand, the response was a resounding no, you can't use the image of Ricky Ponting for intellectual property reasons, which is an interesting concept, you might say, in legal terms as an intellectual property, but there are far more precise measures that one uses in this area, such as was it a breach of copyright or was it a breach of trademark? Intellectual property is just a concept, it's not actually a legal issue. Now, what has transpired is that this is a normal ploy for celebrities and especially their management to either confuse people who are asking permission or for people to just simply say no in a legal sense, when in fact what they're using is the area of trade practices. Okay,
so because you're allowed to use a picture that you own the copyright of, that you've taken the picture.
That's right. A copyright in a photograph will exist if you or I take a picture, a photograph, we've effectively created it, and we will own the copyright in that image, in that physical photograph that's taken. Now, The distinction here, though, is that, say, for instance, if I take a photograph of you and want to apply it to the sale of toothpaste, for instance, or the sale of clothing, because I think Ramona Caval will look great in relation to this photograph I've taken of her, and it's going to help sell this clothing or this toothpaste. Well, that's where the Trade Practices Act comes in, because it will say that that's misleading and deceptive. Although you own the copyright in that photograph, that's not the issue. It's the misleading and deceptive nature of that image of Ramona Caval used with that clothing that is an infringement of Section 52 of the Trade Practices Act.
So, but with this situation with, if I was captain of the cricket team and it was a book about cricket, I mean, where does it lie? Where do the issues lie there? Because presumably, as a captain of a team, I'm just the captain of the team, and maybe that is a fitting thing to have on a book about cricket.
Correct, and that's the issues that you're talking about here are really twofold. One is, once again, we come back to the issue of management of celebrities trying to control the use of the image of their client, of the celebrity, and on the other hand, the ability of, whether it's books, newspapers, magazines, to be able to use, in this case, the captain of a cricket team, on the front of a book, or whether it's the front page of a newspaper. And what, under trade practices, you would have to say is that, well, that, in this case, Ricky Ponting is being associated with that book or that newspaper, to say that that he is authorising that a form of sponsorship or a form of association, which of course doesn't exist. If that was the case, then you wouldn't be seeing all, for instance, the Brownlow medalist winner on the front of the Age or the Herald Sun this morning, because that's the same argument that's being used. You're using my image to sell your product.
Are there different legal concepts surrounding images as opposed to the written word?
Interestingly, the conceptually at copyright law there isn't. At copyright law, whether it's the form of words that are considered to be original or the photograph or the image that's considered to be original, you still need the permission or the authorisation of the person who brought that into existence to use it or to change it.
So what rights do people have over the use or misuse of photos and videos?
Well, if you created it, you're the copyright holder. You own it. You have the ability to sell it,
and this is why
paparazzi
work all over the world, because they just get into positions and they take photos and then they can sell them.
Paparazzi sell it. They usually sell all of their rights straight away because that's where they'll get the maximum dollar from.
Well, all right. Can we just go to a completely different subject now that we can only touch upon today, but it's in the news? The fate of the home of one of our most iconic poets and writers, the late Judith Wright, is reported to be hanging in the balance at the moment. Judith Wright gave her property to the Australian National University to be used for ecological research, specifying on the deed of trust that the property not be sold before 2014 unless there was a necessity to do so. But before she died, she did agree to the ANU selling the property to the Duke of Edinburgh Trust for $1. Now, the Duke of Edinburgh Trust is trying to sell the property after they unsuccessfully attempted to subdivide the land, and of course the Trust stands to make a very large sum of money. Some are saying about $1 million because this is after their $1 investment. So many people are alarmed by this and by the fact that there's never been a heritage assessment of the property. So, I mean, we're going to follow this story as it unfolds, Nick, but I would have imagined there are some serious legal impediments for people wanting to dispose of a major bequest like this. But how binding is a deed of trust?
Well, look, trusts are very complex areas of the law, but when you have a deed of trust, it's like having a contract. And the contract will set up, first of all, your trustees, and then it will have its terms and conditions upon which the trustees are legally bound to follow through, and then you have your beneficiaries at the end of the trust. They're obviously the people that benefit from what is being held in trust. Very legally binding. Now, in the situation in the Judith Wright situation, clearly, well, to me, and I'm speculating here because I don't know all the facts, but it appears to be the age-old problem with these type of situations where the legal responsibilities of the trustees are coming into conflict with what you might say the moral thoughts or interests of either the beneficiaries or interested parties in what we call the trust property.
So, does everyone have to sign a deed of trust? All the people are involved in...
It's certainly to be bound by a deed of trust, and those that are going to be bound by a deed of trust are going to be the trustees, that is, those that are looking after the trust property. Yes, they must be able to sign on. You can't commit a person to look after something unless they've agreed to it.
Yeah, and sometimes, those trusts are actually quite expensive to administer, I would have thought.
Maintenance of trust can be extremely burdensome, and especially in many situations, a lot of the expense is actually having to go to court to actually vary the terms of the trust because of the burdensome nature of the terms and conditions that are contained in it, because naturally times change over the years, but the terms and conditions in a trust deed don't.
Well, as I said, we'll follow the story as it unfolds. But Nick Pullen, thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
Nick Pullen is a lawyer and partner with the firm Trescox Lawyers. And you're with a book show on ABC Radio National with me, Ramona Koval. Still on issues of the law, since the 19th century, copyright has protected the rights of authors. But has this protection become a hindrance to creativity? Well, supporters of Creative Commons licences say the pendulum has swung too far towards protectionism and that this is affecting our creative culture. Creative Commons is an alternative copyright regime that allows people to copy other people's work for free as long as it's not for profit. Critics of Creative Commons say that it means writers lose control of their work. Cory Doctorow has written articles for The Guardian on freeware and copy culture. He's passionate about the future of copyright and says a more democratic approach would be better for writers. He's also a science fiction writer. His latest work is a collection of short stories called Overclocked, which he's published as a book, but it's also available for free on the web under a Creative Commons licence. For the book show, Sarah Lestrange spoke to Cory Doctorow and asked him how he came to embrace Creative Commons.
Well, I had watched a bunch of science fiction writers, my colleagues, have a complete meltdown when they discovered that there was an internet news group where people would scan books one page at a time and then convert that to text and share it with their friends. And they were like, "This is the end of our industry. You people are the moral equivalent of car thieves." One writer even refused to use her real name because she said, "I know you people. You're all hackers. You'll destroy my credit rating if I tell you my real name. You'll make me an unperson and have me mark me as deceased in the social register and so on." And it was just so silly. And I looked at this and I thought, there isn't anyone who does this with a book who doesn't love the book. And this is how people evangelize the stuff that they love. And when I worked in a science fiction bookstore and someone came in and started giving books to their friends and saying, "You have to read this, and you have to read this, and you have to read this," and that's how we sold books. And I remembered, when I was a kid, one kid would subscribe to the science fiction magazine and give it to his father to go take to the office and photocopy for all the other kids. I had become hooked on the genre that way and ended up spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on it as a reader. And I thought that there must be a better way to do this. And I thought rather than use up the energy that a reader might expend in scanning a book and making it available, rather than devote that energy there, I would give them the opportunity to just take that book and share it with their friends without having to do all that labor first. And that seemed to be the right answer. And here I am, 5 books later, 2 more coming out, all planned as Creative Commons releases, and everyone has done better than the last, and my publisher is extremely happy with it. And other people who've done this, it's not just me, but everyone who's done this, as far as I know, has done it again. Everyone's been happy with the outcome.
So it's not the end of publishing, which is what it is posited as. There's something in Creative Commons that is making some publishers suggest that writers not take part in it because it means that once you put your stuff onto Creative Commons, then it's there for perpetuity. So what does this mean for writers, this idea of perpetuity in Creative Commons?
Well, you really have to think about what Creative Commons is for. It's intended to promote reuse. If you are allowing people to reuse your work, and particularly to cut it into new works, the idea that you can subsequently revoke that work is a really dangerous idea. So imagine, for example, that you write a story that's then used as the inspiration to make a piece of music. That piece of music then becomes a creative work unto itself. and is subject to the risk that you might change your mind at some later date. And if you do, you essentially get the right to suppress other works of art. And this has been the case in copyright for a long time. So, award-winning documentaries like Eyes on the Prize, which are about the American Civil Rights Movement, contain tons and tons of stock footage and footage from the heyday of the Civil Rights Movement. It can't be reissued because people couldn't clear the copyrights to do it. And that meant that social studies teachers who wanted to show the documentary series during Black History Month were actually using sellotape to tape back together the VHS cassettes because no one could reissue it on DVD. The idea that copyright should be a tool to suppress artistic work is deeply perverse. There's also a technical question here. Once you allow people to reuse your work and encourage people to reuse your work, finding all the people who've reused your work and getting them to stop again is a daunting question. It's a little like trying to get the food coloring out of the swimming pool. And so even if you gave people a Creative Commons license that wasn't perpetual, enforcing that would be technologically so incredibly complex that I think it would be a non-starter.
You first published under Creative Commons in 2003. Can you just outline what that means for your work in terms of its reuse?
So I've used a bunch of different licenses on my work, but a good example might be my latest short story collection, Overclocked, where those stories are licensed as attribution, share-alike, non-commercial. And what that means is you can make any kind of new works that you want out of my work, provided that you don't charge money for it, and provided that you let other people use your work in the way that you've used mine. So if you want to make fan fiction out of my work, you're welcome to, but you have to let other people make fan fiction out of your work that you've incorporated mine into. You have to repeat my generosity down the line. And that's worked really well. With the last novel, with Someone Comes to Town, Someone Leaves Town, I added something called the Developing Nations License. And what that says is that if you live in a country that's not a high-income nation, according to the World Bank, if you live in a poor country or developing country, you can use the work any way you want. You can make money off of it, you can do local editions, you can translate it, you can do films, you can Bollywood epics or, album rock albums from Nigeria, anything you want to do with it, with the exception that you can't export it back to the developed world. And this seemed to me, on the one hand, just to be good karma. I mean, if you live in a country where the per capita GDP is $30 a month, you're just not going to buy a copy of my books no matter what. So it's just good karma to give those people free books. And then the other thing, it seemed to me, is that for better or for worse, all the best and brightest of developing nations end up in developed nations, if they can. And when they get to Australia or Canada or the United States or Europe, it would be great if they were already fans of mine and could walk down to the bookstore and buy the books now that they were in a position to earning enough to buy them. So that seemed to be the right answer, and it has been.
And so some examples of the way that your books have been reused and reformatted is that people have gone away and they've created lyrics based on some of your stories from Overclocked, and you've got comics happening. Is that all happening under that banner of Creative Commons?
Yeah, most of it, sure. And there have been translations. There's one of my novels has been translated into Brazilian Portuguese and so on, and all that stuff, it happens under the banner of Creative Commons. The comic adaptation, there have been some fan illustrations that were done under the Creative Commons license. The comics, though, are being done by a traditional publisher who paying me money to do a commercial edition, but when they're done, we're going to release those comics under Creative Commons license as well.
And the thing about the translation, you on your website say that your book's been translated by a Slovakian guy, and this happened spontaneously, so you didn't need to source that. So is that one of the benefits then of this process, this regime, is that people can take something up and immediately translate it into something that they can then look at and use? Yeah,
I mean, without getting too highfalutin, I think that it's fair to say that at the core of Creative Commons is the idea that your theories about how the world wants to use your work should be a posteriori, not a priori. So in other words, you shouldn't set out and say, well, I know what the circumstances are under which someone will translate my books into Slovakian, and I know how people want to use my electronic texts and so on, and then impose that on the world. That rather you should, as an entrepreneur and as an artist, allow the world to use your work, observe what they do, and find ways to earn a living and to derive more artistic satisfaction from it.
This is The Book Show on ABC Radio National. I'm Sarah Lestrange. Cory Doctorow is wooing people with his ideas about Creative Commons. It seems that there's two elements to the drive to do this. On the one hand, It's talked about as good marketing. The language you use is that it's good marketing. People will only reuse something if they really love it, and that spreads the word about that thing. But there also seems to be something thrown in there about ideas of democracy. What are those?
Well, so I think that in addition to the commercial dimension, there is a moral dimension and there's an artistic dimension. The moral dimension is really about enabling people to engage in the culture that the law has always permitted of until culture became digital. So it was very hard for a rights holder to police a fan fiction writer or a fanzine publisher because they couldn't find them. And so as a result, we essentially had two copyright laws. We had the copyright law that was what happened when lawyers working for large entertainment companies sued each other. And we had the copyright law that was, since I can't find you and can't see you when you're doing things that at a cultural level and not at a commercial level, I'll just pretend that you're not violating the law. And that's been the way that the law has always worked. But now that you can Google the infringements, and now that you can automate the prosecution of them, we're suddenly seeing these rules that have historically been applied to commerce being applied to culture. And I think that there's a moral dimension to this that says that culture is more important than money. Culture is the ability for human beings to express themselves, to actualize themselves, to be in charge of their destiny, to speak their minds and to communicate is more important than the ability of a publisher to capture every penny of value from a work. And, the marketing dimension says, in fact, if you let a few pennies fall through your hands, more will shower into it from the knock-on uses. But even if that weren't true, I think that the moral dimension stands. I think there's also an artistic dimension, though. I mean, artists are inhabit their era, inhabit their milieu, and it's the 21st century, and bits aren't going to get any harder to copy. If it can be represented as zeros and ones, this can be copied. This is not a moral argument. I'm not saying information wants to be free or information should be free. I'm just saying that if your worldview is predicated on the idea that you can stop people from copying bits, you're going to be terribly disappointed by the coming century. And as an artist, I derive aesthetic satisfaction. My works aren't just nouns, they can be verbs too. My books can not only be a collection of words that I've written, but they can be cultural artifacts that take on a life of their own as they're experienced by my audience. And that's really important to me as an artist as well. And so I'm lucky to have the confluence of these three things. I can do the right thing, I can derive artistic satisfaction from it, and earn a living from it. And that's a great world to be in.
And that social network element we're seeing just exploding through MySpace, through Facebook, and there's literary blogging. These are all creating connections. In the sci-fi world, you write sci-fi short stories. Do you think that community is more given to this style of approach to reusing and commenting on each other's work in cyberspace in that world?
Well, so that really has always been part of the way science fiction is written and read. Fanzine culture has always been a big piece of science fiction culture, and fan fiction has always been a big piece of science fiction. But I also think that engineers, and therefore by extension science fiction fans, because the overlap on the Venn diagram is significant, that engineers in large part defined the culture, engineers and scientists defined the culture of the internet because they were the first inhabitants of it. So a great example is the way that email works. When you hit Control-R, it imports all the text of the message you're reading, right? When you're replying to a message, it imports all of it and flows it into the new message so that you can go through and mark it up. Now, this looks a lot like what academics do to each other, right? I've sent you a paper and you've gone through it with a red pencil and given it back to me. It's exactly the opposite of how a copyright lawyer would structure it, because technically speaking, every time you hit Control-R, you commit an act of copyright infringement because you make a copy of the text that has been sent to you. You make a holus bolus copy of it. And so if lawyers were defining the culture of the internet, Control-R would never work the way that it works. But the fact that engineers and scientists were there first, and by extension science fiction fans, the internet's culture acts a lot more like that scholarly and scientific culture than it does like the legal culture. And that's part of the collision that we're seeing now. But it also means that all the first fandoms on the internet, the first social activity on the internet was driven by science fiction fans, by engineers and scientists, and by technophiles, who were the first adopters of computers, who also overlap a lot with science fiction fans. And so everything that people do on the internet is subtly influenced by science fiction, in the same way that the fact that like the BBC has been such a great exporter of British culture means that even when you watch an American movie, if you get an American comedy, chances are the comedy writers who watched it cut their teeth watching BBC comedies. So even as the BBC is re-importing British culture, or American culture, it ends up getting a little bit of British culture too.
Your collection of short stories, Overclocked, kind of plays on other great science fiction writers' work. So one of the pieces you've written, Anders Game, is a play on Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Could you describe why you're playing with the works of other great sci-fi writers?
Well, so Ender's Game is actually really a play on an Ender's Game, on Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, although I do mash up a lot of bits and pieces of Bradbury in the story. A lot of the proper names are taken from Bradbury. Bradbury is a hero of mine. I think he's one of the great writers of our era. But I think that he says really silly things about his books. Like when Michael Moore made Fahrenheit 9/11, he said that it was morally wrong for Michael Moore to have titled his film, to have given his film the same title as a title derived from Fahrenheit 451, which is ridiculous. I mean, science fiction, more than any genre, but all genres have recycled titles. I mean, how many Song of Solomons are there? But science fiction in particular, it's almost like, skaters have to master the triple Lutz. Science fiction writers write stories with each other's titles all the time too. And so I wanted to write a story I wanted to write a series of stories that had the same titles as famous stories. So I've got an I, Robot, and I, Rowboat, and Ender's Game, and I've got a story coming that Ben Rosenbaum and I are writing called True Names, and I think I'll probably do Jeff Diaz 5 after that.
There seems to be a cultural divide in terms of people who are inclined to follow through with Creative Commons. The story that you wrote, Anders Game, it's about young girls who are gamers. It's sort of talking to a different generation from Luddites. Would you say you've seen that division when you're talking with people about this issue?
Absolutely. I think that there are people for whom the internet intuitively makes a lot of sense, and people for whom the internet requires some thinking before you get the right intuition. And generally that breaks down generationally, but not always. Some of the most forward thinkers I know on this subject are a generation older than me, and some of them are musicians, and some of them are technical people, and some of them are other kind of people. So I don't think that age or vocation are necessarily a good predictor of this. After all, Bill Gates is about as nerdy as they come, and he's got an entirely incorrect intuition about how the internet works, if you ask me. After all, Microsoft's strategy for the first 10 years that the internet was popular was, let's not use the internet and see if we can replace it with something of our own devising. So I think that while it's true that many times the intuition is carried by young people, it's not always the case.
Interesting. Cory Doctorow talking to the book show's Sarah Lestrange. His latest collection of short stories is called Overclocked. It's published by Thunder's Mouth Press, or you can just download it for free from his website, craphound.com. craphound.com. This is the book show. You can download us for free too from abc.net.au/rn/bookshow on ABC Radio National. I'm Ramona Koval.
G'day Gladys. One good story is not enough for you. You deserve three. You'll get them on Late Night Live after 4 and after 6 in the West. Bruce Baird says ta-ta to federal politics. Burma has to deal with its rebellious monks, and we look at the issue of philanthropy and humanities. Can corporate sponsorship save our culture? Late Night Live, ABC Radio National.
That's where you are, in the book show. Now, there's losing yourself in a city and losing yourself in a book. Then there's the disappearance of buildings from a city and the disappearance from our memories of those buildings and the people who lived and worked in them. As a way of bringing these lost things back to us, Ian Sinclair has edited a book called London, City of Disappearances, and Alison Croggan has been finding her way through its pages.
You can no more summarise London, City of Disappearances, than you can summarise London itself. It's not a book that you can read sensibly from the front page to the back and close with a satisfying bang, certain in your grasp of what you've just experienced. It is, rather, a book that you inhabit. You trip over the things, forget things, find yourself fascinated, bored, fascinated again. It's the kind of book that you pick up and open at random to find yourself wandering through spectral industrial landscapes or forgotten streets lined with strip clubs and ghostly bookshops. You enter compulsive fictions that solidify into bricks and mortar, or realities that dissolve into vapour as you approach them. Time warps and hiccups. You get lost. London, City of Disappearances is, as the editor Ian Sinclair says in his introduction, a gazetteer of erasures, each disappearance represented by a random object or image, a cabinet of curiosities. Or, elsewhere, entries for an ever-expanding encyclopedia of loss. The losses include possibilities unrealised, things that never were. It's a book that is as full of unanswered longing as memory itself. It doesn't attempt to describe London so much as to mimic the city. The metropolis here is a living hive, a dense web of memories and transient relationships, an organic architecture that breathes and decays like a living body. As the contributor Bill Drummond recounts, this anthology springs out of a very simple idea. The remit for this piece, he says, was vague but simple. Did I want to write about things in London disappearing? Drummond then goes on to tell us, the trouble is, I don't really give a shit about London. Never lived there. Wouldn't mind if the whole lot disappeared before my eyes. Which shows clearly that Sinclair's editorial eye, as might be expected for one of Britain's most widely respected, innovative writers, is neither limited nor petty. Each contributor brings his or her London, the London they hate, the London they lost, the London they barely survived, the London they love. Like any great city, London is infinitely multiple. Sinclair has organised the book into sections with an acutely sensitive eye for detail and nuance. Some parts are geographic, the West End, the East End, and some are thematic, like a section called Bibliomania, which might in fact be a subheading for the entire book. And the narratives evolve with the unpredictable beauty of Mandelbrot fractals. One account answers or contradicts another. An allusion in one piece might turn up as the subject of the next. At more than 600 pages, with almost 60 contributors, it makes a hefty and fascinatingly complex tome. Unsurprisingly, this is, above all, a city made of words. It excavates a literary London inhabited by famous names, Daniel Defoe, John Lennon, Alan Sillitoe, William Blake, John Bunyan, but also haunted by transient eccentrics, forgotten poets, and vanished bookshops. It attracted my eye in part because, as well as writers like Marina Warner, Michael Moorcock, Will Self, J.G. Ballard or Thomas de Quincey, the contributors include many important figures from the counterculture of contemporary British poetry, a scene from which Ian Sinclair himself emerges. It's a chance to read some fascinating writers like Lee Harwood, Tom Rayworth or Bill Griffiths. Through these fragmented texts rises a narrative rich with baroque and shabby detail, shining like an oil slick with a hypnotic and sometimes toxic fascination. Stuart Home, for instance, launches a scathing attack on what he calls the zombification of the British counterculture, the heroin chic of the 1960s that, among other people, destroyed his mother. Recalling a famous poetry event attended by William Burroughs and R.D. Laing, Home writes, "The state of revolt marks the onset of counter-cultural rigor mortis, and this living death occurred not with a bang, but a smacked-out whimper. It is also a death that we won't fully comprehend until the chatter of neo-critical production about the 1960s ceases to mask the violent silence that lies at the core of that decade and which will yet prove to be its most enduring legacy." And then there's Anne Bare's haunting memories of Mervyn Peake, or John Welch's poignant account of a couple of unknown writers who lived on the margins of the literary life with, as he describes it, its interminable fantasies of inclusion and exclusion. Among the most moving sections of the book are its evocations of the long-vanished Jewish Whitechapel in the East End, which never recovered from the bombs of the Second World War. There is a beautiful remembrance of the great Yiddish poet Avram Nachum Stenkel, who died poverty-stricken and forgotten, and of Kafka's final lover Dora Diamant, who fled to London as a refugee from Nazism and lived there for the rest of her life. And through these overtly literary remembrances and fictions weave many other ghosts. Anthony Rudolph's startlingly beautiful oral recordings of his grandfather Joseph Rudolph, dealer in second-hand clothes and army surplus, or Eileen Philby, the destroyed wife of the celebrated spy Kim, or the millionaire king of the vanished strip clubs of Soho, Paul Raymond. And woven between these accounts, like a roll call of the dead, is a list of vanished buildings, short, bald descriptions of the histories of specific addresses. As you read on, distinctions between fiction and history begin to corrode. An extract from a 19th century Times article looks as authentic or inauthentic as a fiction. The cumulative effect is a little like reading a book by W.G. Sebald, if you could imagine Sebald refracted through a multifaceted prism into 60 very individual voices. The details of Sinclair's curios emerge in a kind of melancholy clarity that is heightened by an acute sense of mortality. It's a darkly enchanting book that I'll return to again and again, if only because, like London itself, it needs long acquaintance to begin to discover all its mysteries. Above all, this book is a giant act of imaginative recuperation. It becomes clear that in writing about disappearance, all these writers are in fact creating another kind of magic. They conjure up the unseen and the hidden and bring it into the light.
That's the masterful reviewer Alison Croggan guiding us through the pages of one of the world's most imaginative cities. London, City of Disappearances is edited by Ian Sinclair and published by Hamish Hamilton. You're in The Book Show. I'm Ramona Koval on ABC Radio National. Now, on tomorrow's book show, Scottish novelist A.L. Kennedy talking with me in Edinburgh about her new novel, that's a new word, Day is the novel's name, a Second World War tail gunner and prisoner of war, Mr. Day, who in 1949 becomes an extra in a war film, and through his experiences on the film in a prisoner of war role and flashbacks to his time as a prisoner, tells us the story of his life. It sounds complex and it's very, very good. A.L. Kennedy on the book show tomorrow. Just after 10 a.m. You can hear us again by listening at midnight or going to our website and podcasting abc.net.au/rn/bookshow. That's all from me, Ramona Koval. See you tomorrow.
You've been listening to another ABC Radio National podcast. ABC Radio National, on air and online, with many of our programs available as podcasts or MP3 downloads. All the details at abc.net.au/rn/podcast.